Ignition, Floyd.
Roger. Clock start, Flight. Roger. Touch it, so all English. Roger. Okay, battle has...
Men have been embarking on odysseys since the dawn of civilization.
Okay, we're going one, Capcom.
In 1970, Captain James Lovell, commander of the ill-fated Apollo 13 mission, named his command module Odyssey.
I decided to look up the definition of Odyssey, and it was indeed a long voyage with many changes of fortune.
That it was, in spades.
Houston, we've had a problem. We've had a main B bus undervolt. You see an AC bus undervolt there, guide?
The granddaddy of all Odysseys comes to us from 1,000 years before Christ. Translated to film in this old Kirk Douglas movie, it is the story of a mythical Greek warrior named Odysseus and his search for home. Together with its companion poem, the Iliad, they form Western literature's first action-adventure story, written by the man we call Homer. It is a grand adventure, an allegory of all our lives, writ large. We first meet Odysseus in the Iliad, during one of the most famous wars in history, the Trojan War. We think the actual war happened, if it happened at all, around 1200 BC. It is in the Iliad that we read of Helen of Troy, the face that launched 1,000 ships, and in the Odyssey, the Trojan horse, which taught us to beware of Greeks bearing gifts, or gifts bearing Greeks. The warriors of the Iliad have left a legacy from the sublime to the ridiculous. Achilles can be found in medical books. Ajax is on every supermarket shelf. Names and images that have survived 3,000 years.
These are the first stories we have in the West. And that means that if they're to last, and they have lasted for so long, they must be about virtually everything. Every time you pick up one of those stories, you're on the edge of talking about something archetypal, something that's always with us, something that's wonderfully generalized.
The Iliad focuses on the archetype of one sort of hero, Achilles. Powerful, straightforward, and terrifying, the professional soldier. It tells of Achilles' great hubris, or pride, his destructive rage when that pride is injured, and finally his death at the hands of Paris. The most complex hero of the Iliad goes on to star in the Odyssey. Odysseus, whom the Romans called Ulysses, was a different kind of hero. Odysseus was a draftee, brave, bold, a liar, and very, very human.
You may remember that James Joyce wrote his great work, Ulysses, based on Homer, and when he was asked why he did it, he said it was because Ulysses was the only complete man in literature. He said that the other great figures in literature are not complete. Hamlet was not a complete man, nor any of the other figures who play a leading role in literature. But in Ulysses, we see the person who was canny, courageous, devious, full of love and hate, and ready to face all challenges.
The descendants of Odysseus are legion. We meet them today in action-adventure heroes like Indiana Jones. Odysseus has fought long and hard at Troy on behalf of his ally, King Agamemnon. When that brutal war is over, Odysseus is eager to return to his beloved wife, Penelope, and to reassert himself as the head of the kingdom of Ithaca. The Odyssey is about that return trip. it is also an extended lesson in decorum.
The main moral code governing human action in the Odyssey, it is this code of the protection of the stranger, of hospitality, of looking after people who turn up in your country. And it's a system, too. It's a system in which you don't do it just out of pure good-heartedness. Someday you may be in his country, and you expect that he will return all the gifts you've given him.
The same basic rules of hospitality persist today, but mostly as the polite conventions of, say, a dinner party. The guest gets fed. In return, he entertains the host. But back when civilization was just beginning to take hold, an offer of a meal could mean the difference between survival and death.
If you are going to travel around on an Odyssey, there are no motels you can stop at, and there is the bargain of the give and take of hospitality. So there is the practical aspect of it. And then there is the moral aspect of it, which appears not only in Greek literature, but in practically every religious literature in the world, of the idea that you must be hospitable to people, you must take people in, you must share what you have. And it's made very explicit in the Odyssey.
The return trip can be looked at as a series of tests, each one of which Odysseus has to pass to reach home.
Odysseus' adventures, if we see them as tests, are much larger versions of the kinds of crises and problems and issues and adventures to which each of us is subject over the course of life. And we see him as someone confronted with problems which are really so much more intense than the ones you and I would ever experience.
The voyage from Troy back to Ithaca should have taken Odysseus about 2 weeks. Instead, it took 10 years. What became a very bad trip started with the host's poor manners and a hero's mistake. A big mistake. After all, Odysseus was an epic hero. He and his crew came ashore on the island of the Cyclops in search of food, and find themselves unwanted guests in the cave of a Cyclops named Polyphemus. The wary Odysseus introduces himself using an alias, No Man. This witty AKA protects Odysseus, though not all of his men. Instead of having dinner served as they expected, some of them are served as the main course.
The Odyssey not only contains the basic rule, which is watch out whom you turn from your door, but it is full of marvelous examples of good and bad hosts and good and bad guests. You have the ultimate in bad hosts, who is Polyphemus, who says, why should I bother? I don't feel obligated, which is what a lot of people say today. And so he takes his guests and batters their brains on the floor and eats them. This is a big no-no in the etiquette rules of hospitality. Do not, repeat, not eat your guests.
Rules are rules. The giant, having been such a dreadful host, pays dearly for his rude behavior. His payback? A poke in the eye with a sharp stick. Odysseus has triumphed.
The Greeks liked this story for a number of reasons. First of all, it pitted a wily, clever Greek against a monster who was bigger and stronger, and yet the Greek wins out over him because he's so intelligent.
When initially Polyphemus, having been blinded and running out of his cave in rage and in anger, and in trying to get the guy who did him in, who has told him up to this point, my name is No Man, and it's a play, but Polyphemus doesn't get it. He's too dumb. But Odysseus wouldn't be Odysseus if he chose to be remembered as No Man. And in fact, we wouldn't be sitting here talking about him if that's all he had said. It's when he believes he's out of Polyphemus' reach that he yells back, the one who has blinded you, I am Odysseus, sacker of cities.
Son of Laertes and king of Ithaca!
The giant's father, Poseidon, is all-powerful in the realm of the sea. Polyphemus can't retaliate, but Dad can and does. Poseidon consigns Odysseus to wander the sea and will send him through many a dangerous test.
And so all of Odysseus' travails at Poseidon's hands, presumably, are a consequence of that need to say who I am. And I remind you in Greek, is ego, his ego, himself. And that is Odysseus. He is self, he is ego, he's the individual.
This individual is going to have a long journey home. A Greek historian of the 2nd century BC mapped what he thought was the Odyssey's itinerary. It was a route that took Odysseus to 12 different destinations, including Egypt, Africa, and Sicily, and across thousands of nautical miles. Along the way, he would lose each of his ships and all of his men. Some ego trip. Myth is not mere fiction. Its origins lie in the efforts of early peoples to explain the world about them. Myth can be thought of as a form of history, or even an early stab at science. To the ancient Greeks, the supernatural deities who lived on Mount Olympus represented two things: the forces of nature, like water, wind, and air, and the nature of man, his desire, ambition, anger, and jealousy. And the gods not only reflected the world, they also shaped its destiny. The siege of Troy, which left Odysseus to embark on his monumental journey, is the direct result of squabbling among the gods. Not only do the gods set things in motion, but throughout the story they are never far from the action. In this all-star struggle, Athena, the goddess of wisdom and champion of Odysseus, could represent reason and civilization, while Poseidon represents raw emotion and the forces of nature. We think of an odyssey as a long trip, a series of wanderings, a journey filled with adventure and hardships. We all follow our own odyssey, our own voyage through life, searching for the serenity of home. Homer evoked this human odyssey in a poem of 12,000 lines, the first known masterpiece.
Sing to me of the man, Muse, the man of twists and turns, driven time and again off course once he had plundered the hallowed heights of Troy. Many cities of men he saw and learned their minds. Many pains he suffered, heart-sick on the open sea, struggling to save his life. Launch out on his story, Muse, daughter of Zeus. Start from where you will. Sing for our time, too.
Who was Homer? No one really knows. The question has baffled scholars for 3,000 years. The poet who is thought to have created the Western world's first great works of literature is an enigma.
Now this guy Homer, did he write both? Or is there a Homer who wrote either? Or is it someone else who happens to be named Homer who wrote these books and not the guy we think? Or is it a compendium that somehow came together during a period that we then associate with someone named Homer?
We call him Homer, but we know really nothing about him at all. There are all kinds of legends that he was a wandering schoolmaster who went around reciting his poems.
He may even have been a woman. That's what Samuel Butler suggested. But we don't know who he was, or some people even deny, some scholars even wonder whether there was a Homer.
So I don't know who Homer is. All I know is that I'm entertained magnificently by what he, she, they, or it offer, and that both the light and the heavy aspects of what they offer are an endless source of amusement and amazement to me.
Whoever he was, he evoked an heroic age in his works, a time of warrior kings and courageous seafarers, of a civilization rich in gold. Homer's epic poems have given generation after generation of Greek people enduring legends about their past. Of course, it was all myth, or so we thought. And then along came Heinrich Schliemann, a rich and highly controversial amateur archaeologist who thought Homer was telling history, and he set out to prove it.
Schliemann was, as you probably know, a self-educated merchant from Germany who, when he made it in the business world, he fulfilled his boyhood wish to become an archaeologist. And he did it with such excitement and such deep devotion to it that he memorized the Iliad and the Odyssey in the Greek original. He knew them by heart.
Schliemann went to Turkey to prove his theory and found what he believed to be the site of Troy. To this day, the find is disputed, but Schliemann was convinced. Next, he traveled to the Greek mainland, to the site of the ancient civilization at Mycenae, purportedly home of the legendary king Agamemnon. Schliemann began excavating just inside the city walls, looking for royal burial tombs. Months later, he struck gold, unearthing 30 pounds of delicate artifacts. Among them, a mask he claimed was the mask of Agamemnon.
He had wonderful success at Mycenae. In fact, at Mycenae, I believe, was his biggest success, because he found the only intact royal burials that we know. Almost overnight, he made every academic person who did not believe the stories of Homer rethink the question of historicity in Homer.
Schliemann had discovered evidence of a highly developed, warfaring Greek civilization that flourished between 1550 and 1100 BC, the Late Bronze Age. At the height of their influence, the Mycenaeans were established in what is now Sicily, Turkey, Egypt, and northern Greece. It was a rich and powerful civilization, but it ended abruptly. We aren't sure why. We only know that by the end of the 12th century BC, the Mycenaean world had disintegrated. Even its primitive alphabet, what we call Linear B, was lost. The experts suggest invasion, famine, or disease, perhaps a revolt. Some think economic decline inspired Mycenaean marauders to raid other lands and cities, and that the Trojan War might actually have been just 10 years of plunder. In any case, the storied fall of Troy coincided with the splintering and death of the Mycenaean Empire. There followed 4 largely unrecorded centuries, 400 years of darkness. What legends survived did so through a system of oral storytelling. Bards who memorized the tales added their own spin and sang them to audiences all over Greece. The rhythms and structure of music no doubt served as aids to the memorization of thousands of lines of poetry.
The word is what ties us to the past, and of course, long before there was writing, mothers were talking to their children, and that was the beginning of the oral tradition. And the oral tradition, which was perpetuated by the bards, was something that that preserved the essence of the story and allowed embellishment to meet the expectations of every particular audience.
We think Homer lived in the 8th century BC, 300 to 400 years after the collapse of Mycenae, when Greece was emerging from its long night. He was the greatest of a long line of bards, the one who took countless variations on the ancient legends and coalesced them into one great masterwork. It may be hard to imagine now, but Homer must once have wowed his audiences with poetry set to music that probably sounded something like this.
factis klecathemenos en faba.
For the next great Greek civilization, the Greece of Socrates and Plato, history began with Homer's poem about a war at Troy. The poems taught this disparate and often warring group of peoples and city-states the exploits of their heroes and the wisdom of their culture. Greek authors quoted them much as moderns quote the Bible and Shakespeare. Like the later legends of Roland and Arthur, the Iliad and the Odyssey were literally nation-building myths. Homer might, with more than poetic justice, be called the father of his country. No alphabet had survived those dark centuries between Mycenae and Homer's Greece. It was in his lifetime, we think, that Greeks began to adapt the alphabet of Phoenician traders. Some believe Homer himself may have written his poems down on papyrus. All we can say for sure is that someone did, but papyrus decomposes, and the poems had to be repeatedly copied, often from decaying originals. The stories began to vary widely. Finally, in the 3rd century BC, 500 years after Homer's death, a definitive copy was made by Greek scholars in the great library at Alexandria. This version would continue to be recopied in Roman times and down through the Middle Ages. After years at sea, Odysseus wants desperately to get home, but Poseidon keeps him from succeeding. Beset by troubles, he lands at the island of the sorceress, Circe. His men behave badly at her table, and she turns them into pigs. The god Hermes has given Odysseus a potion that makes him immune, and instructs him to sleep with the beautiful witch so that she will return his crew to human form.
Well, I always found it, beautiful and haunting, the magical aspect. But it's funny, too, that Circe turns these men into swine, but not because she's a malicious witch, but because in a way she's dispensing justice. They behave terribly at her table, and in a way she's just metaphorically realizing their inner swine, I guess we'd call it nowadays. In a way they had it coming, and even as a child I relished that part. The sirens may be the more, if you're talking about the seductive vamp, they seem I guess they're trying to shipwreck these guys. That seems more abstract malice, whereas Circe would seem to be making a sort of crusader's point.
But Circe is only one of several women Odysseus encounters in his wanderings.
Women are very important in the poem. Women see him off on all his journeys, and I think, again, this is another metaphor for the simple fact that our mothers give us birth. They start us on life's journey, and of course the other side of the coin from birth is death. And another thing that Odysseus learns in the poem is that he's a human being, or what it is to be a human being.
Odysseus later encounters Calypso, the goddess, not the dance. That sets off another seduction and another test for our hero. For Calypso offers him immortality if he will stay with her. But immortality isn't all it's cracked up to be. By the way, Calypso's name in Greek means barrier or concealer. What Odysseus is offered is a vegetable existence, a symbolic death. He rejects it, but he either can't or isn't in any hurry to leave, which may say something about our hero.
He spends a year with Circe. He spends a year wining and dining and sleeping with this magnificent goddess. Now, it's true. Because of who he is, he was able to rescue his men. But then, his men and he would have been there forever if they hadn't finally griped sufficiently to say, all right, all right, all right. And now he wants to leave. He spends 7 years with Calypso before we find him on the beach weeping about wanting to go home to Penelope. So those are sides of him which I don't find so admirable. I can't say that if I were in his boots, I would do any differently, but I still don't find it admirable.
And so the message that Odysseus is getting is that he should live. He should not ask for immortality through fame or even immortality as the consort of a goddess lonely on an island, such as Calypso offers, but go home and live life. And find the good things in life and survive as a mortal person. And this is the choice he makes all the way through.
I think when you recover from a bad romance, you also think of Circe, Calypso, you know, the vamp or the side trip on life's journey. And Penelope's in the background of the Odyssey at all times. She's at the end of the line. But there's a lot of forays and side trips in the Odyssey that makes it surprisingly modern.
The Odyssey has been recreated as entertainment countless times. This silent film version was made in 1924, long before anyone thought of a character like Big Bird. During the Middle Ages, the works of Homer survived primarily in the monasteries, but the Renaissance resurrected him, and the first printed editions of Homer appeared in Florence in 1488. Soon they were available all over Europe. He was a hit again. His poetry has been translated from the Greek into every tongue imaginable, and he has inspired more than just the translators.
Homer's the beginning of the epic tradition. Without Homer, I guess there would have been a Virgil, but he wouldn't have been as good. There would have been a Dante, but he wouldn't have been as good. There would have been a Milton, but he wouldn't have been as good. And so on, through Keats, through Tennyson, through James Joyce. That's where Homer goes. And that's why a whole literary tradition comes out of him, depends on him, and by the same token is constantly bringing him back into life.
More recently, Mark O'Donnell has brought him back to life, if only to get over him. Actually, Homer is the protagonist's homosexual lover in O'Donnell's latest novel. But the earlier Homer has an important place in this writer's intellectual universe, the Odyssey in particular.
Well, the neat thing about the word Odyssey is it's entered our language as both the definition of the novel and the definition of life itself. That you say, oh, that was an Odyssey, whether you're talking about a long book or a crazy life. That's a sign of the Odyssey's power. First of all, that it's the first novel, and that's sort of primordial. Plus, you mix in the magic and the travel, and it gains quite a power and stature. And for my novel, which is a ridiculous farce about, you know, miscrossed romance in modern times, I thought it was cheeky of me to borrow from the greatest of novels for a loose model. But secretly, I also wanted to borrow some of its magic and mystery, because even in the craziest of farces, there's some of life's magic underlying.
Even more than nation-building myths for the Greeks, Homer's works were the templates for the Western literary tradition. From the Iliad comes tragic drama. From the Odyssey, the novel. And the action-adventure hero has never died. Homer gives us two books and two kinds of hero. Which do we prefer? Achilles, who throws himself into the fray heedless of the outcome, or Odysseus, who schemes to win and survive?
Indiana Jones is certainly one of the most popular heroes of today. All my little nieces and nephews know who he is. And he's more than creatures like Rambo or Arnold Schwarzenegger's Terminator, who are just mere brute force. He's like wily Ulysses in that he's got a PhD in archaeology, and he can not only, you know, dodge the arrows and steal the object, he can also recognize its value and appraise it for you.
Like Indiana Jones, the heroics of Odysseus are more complicated.
He has one other added quality, which is a very fertile intelligence and a willingness to lie in order to get what he wants, which is certainly not part of Achilles, who hates, like the gates of hell, the man who thinks one thing and says another, which is exactly a wonderful description of Odysseus. He's doing this all the time.
It is no accident that Odysseus is the great master negotiator and diplomat, because he's really good at not saying what he thinks, but saying what will be useful under the circumstances, for which he got a very bad reputation.
Homer had anticipated Machiavelli. Complete honesty may not always be the best policy.
People always say, why can't they say what they really mean? Because if you say what you really mean when you have a volatile situation like that, you mean, I'd like to bomb you back to the Stone Age. That's what you really mean. And so instead, you say, artificially, we would like to reach some kind of compromise that we can both live with, so that everybody can continue living. So it is an absolutely essential part of, the city. That's where the Greek word comes from. Civility, civilization, it's all the same thing.
I think Odysseus is a hero who can be admired for different reasons at different times. He's a survivor, basically. People like to see him as a hero, but in fact he's almost an anti-hero.
For quite a while, virtue was essential for a proper hero, but not for Homer, and obviously not for us.
If you depicted a perfect person now, it would have to be for a lampoon, Dudley Do-Right, Roger Ramjet, an absurd paragon of virtue. We doubt virtue now, so super virtuous heroes are a little harder to take.
Still, we want our heroes to have a moral compass. We want them to try to do right.
To do the classy thing. And they occasionally say, what would, Frank Sinatra or St. Augustine do in this case? What would Abe Lincoln do? They talk about a collapse of morals. My idea of a hero is not necessarily vanquishing in battle, but treating everyone with respect and surviving, if nothing else. That's the bottom line. We often regard mere survivors as heroes, and as despairing as that sounds, it certainly is true enough.
Homer makes clear his preference between the two sets of heroic virtues. In the end, even Achilles votes for survival. Circe tells Odysseus that he must visit the underworld before he can continue his journey. There he meets Achilles again, a dead Achilles.
Achilles is the same tough character he is in the Iliad, no nonsense. He doesn't put up with any guff from anyone. And Odysseus tries to mollify him by saying, look, Achilles, you were honored in life, and here in the underworld, everybody honors you. Achilles looks at him and he says, look, don't praise death to me. I'd rather be the meanest slave on earth than king of the dead. The tales have a purpose. They are not repetitive. They show Odysseus facing a number of different challenges, and as he goes through these tales, in each one of them, he is invited to forget the return home, to forget home, to stop living in a way, to die, to cop out. But he has learned something on these journeys, and I think what he's learned is life with all its suffering is better than anything else. Stay alive.
Let's make sure we don't blow the whole mission.
Things were getting colder. We were not getting any sleep. The strain and the stress was slowly gathering on us.
Now we're proceeding to...
And of course, as we approached the moon, it got to be bigger and bigger and bigger.
Going back up the Odyssey.
This is my second trip out there now, and not to land was a real trial, a mental trial for me.
For Apollo 13, the moon had become a place they had to pass by. Just as in the Odyssey, the adventurers had to pass by the seductive sirens in order to get home.
And we looked down at those ancient old craters as we skipped across. There is a tremendous drawing power. Just 60 miles below, we could land and walk on the surface of the moon.
The siren song. Odysseus is told to stop up his ears against creatures whose beautiful song lures sailors to their death. He has himself tied to the mast, so he can both listen and resist.
The sirens became aware of the sea-swift vessel running by them, wherefore they clearly sang to us their song. Hither, come hither, O much-praised Odysseus. Come to us, O glory of Achaea. Bring your ship to land so you may listen to our voices. Never yet has any man in a dark ship passed us by without lending ear to the honey-sweet music of our lips, to go away spirit-gladdened and riper in knowledge. We know all that comes to be on the much-nourishing earth. My heart desired to listen, and I told my companions to free me. They bound me in further bonds and constrained me more.
Very similar to the Odyssey and Odysseus, being so close, instead of tied to the mast, we're tied to the spacecraft, our only means of getting home.
What the sirens offered is one of the big questions. It's been a conundrum since antiquity. It was a question that the Emperor Tiberius asked his grammarians, and they didn't know how to answer it. We do get part of the answer in the Odyssey. The siren song is given in part, and the literary interpretation is that probably they offered knowledge of what had happened in the past and what would happen in the future. This is a great lure to Odysseus.
T-9.
Who wouldn't want knowledge?
6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. Ignition.
Ignition, flight. Roger.
Liftoff.
Apollo 13's change of fortune meant its crew never reached their destination.
Looks good here, flight. Good agreement.
But like Odysseus, they learned something about themselves. And like Odysseus, they were on the adventure of their lives.
Okay, we're go, flight. Looks good here.
I think we are all somewhat explorers. I mean, we all have that fascination about doing things, whether it's in our fantasy or whether we actually do things.
Guidance. Go, guidance. We've had a hardware restart. I don't know what it was. Okay. Houston, we've had a problem. Okay, Houston.
Life would be rather dull if you didn't have some exploration, some adventure, something that you can look back on and say, I really enjoyed that, or I got by it okay, or I never expected that I'd have the courage to do what I did.
Odysseus has been years on his journey now, sailing from one ordeal to another, and more to come. Having gotten past the sirens, Odysseus knows his route will take the ship past the deadly whirlpool Charybdis and the many-headed monster Scylla, who lives in a cave above the sea. And between them he must make a choice. Which is the lesser evil?
He always has choices. He has the choice of going past Scylla or taking the route of the whirlpool, and he's been told that if he takes the whirlpool, it's most likely that the whole ship will be destroyed, sucked down into this terrible Charybdis. On the other hand, he knows that if he goes past Scylla, he will lose 6 men. So he decides not to tell his men about that, because he realizes that if they knew that 6 of them would die, they would stop rowing in that direction. And he tries to fight Scylla, but she cannot be fought. He has been told that too. And before he even sees her coming, Scylla has taken 6 of his men and is eating them up in the mouth of her cave. And he thinks this is the most horrible sight he's ever seen. But he gets through.
We're often faced with lousy choices. Life seems to be a long succession of trade-offs, and survival itself comes at a price, as Odysseus has learned. Homecoming is an eternal theme, an archetype, as strong today as in the time of Odysseus.
The theme of homecoming appeals to everyone. Everyone who's fought in a foreign war, people who've taken hazardous journeys of any kind, even to the casual journey. There's great pleasure in coming home to the place that is yours, that is familiar to you, and to the people especially.
Last drill. Go for it, Doc.
These veterans of World War II gather often at a Northern Virginia hardware store to lend a helping hand, and then trade stories of war and homecoming.
I finally got home. My dad worked in a bakery shop, and I walked in the bakery shop, and he saw me, and he went up to his boss, and he said, "Bob's home." That's it. And we took off. It was the most pleasant thing you ever saw.
Homecoming, it means coming back to the first dawn, to the first sounds, to the trees that you first saw. That is unforgettable. Whatever else you see, they don't replace them. So memory is what keeps you here.
Between the Trojan War and the sea voyage, Odysseus has been away from the kingdom of Ithaca for 20 years. In the meantime, the young men of the kingdom have taken over his household. They are demanding that his wife, Penelope, give her husband up for dead and marry one of them. But Penelope has stalled them. She says that when she completes the shroud she is weaving, she will marry. But she weaves by day and secretly unweaves by night.
If she was giving in to the suitors, then there would not be any kingdom for her and for her son. So she found a way of postponing the marriage so she can gain time.
When are these people going to go home? They have been here forever. They are eating us out of house and home. And what's more, they're trying to marry the lady of the house. And in the meantime, they are amusing themselves with the women servants. Bad, bad guess.
Finally, Odysseus reaches Ithaca. But the goddess Athena has warned about the traitors who lie in wait for him at the palace. And he goes home disguised as a beggar.
He's the outsider. There's a wonderful irony. We know who he is. We see the suitors doing things that they ought not to be doing to any beggar, but especially not to this beggar, because this beggar is the king, and he will, we know, reestablish himself.
Alms for a child of misfortune.
So there's a kind of tension that builds, and we wonder how Odysseus is going to achieve this, because he's all alone, one man against 100+ suitors. How's he going to do this?
The queen.
The besieged Penelope finally proposes a contest to the suitors. She will marry the man who can string the bow that belonged to her husband and shoot an arrow through a dozen axes.
Homer has built the picture of them as ugly to make us feel not only comfortable, but I think very satisfied with that magnificent moment when one after the other of these little twerps has tried and not been able to string the bow, and that wonderful moment when Odysseus, it's the fantasy we all have. It's being pulled out of the audience to step onto the basketball court and being the superstar that no one knew was the superstar. Odysseus the beggar suddenly stands up straight and strong, with ease strings the bow, bam, bam, bam. And man, is that satisfying to our baser and my baser and uglier instincts.
The tests are over, at least for now. And for the first time in 20 years, Odysseus and Penelope embrace. Really home at last.
That's not icing on the cake. That's the very cake itself. That's the very substance of the poem. That coming back to home, coming back to earth, embracing it, and finding that's where one has begun and where one wants to go ultimately.
So joy is now to her the sight of her husband vivid in her gaze, that her white arms embracing his neck would never for a moment let him go. Dawn with her rose-red fingers might have shone upon their tears, if with her glinting eyes Athena had not thought of one more thing. She held back the night, and night lingered long at the western edge of the earth, while in the east she reigned in the dawn. While in the east she reigned in the dawn.
But now, if the Odyssey is life, can the still living Odysseus be finished with his struggle? Not quite. After setting his own house in order, he must negotiate a truce between his supporters and the relatives of the suitors he has just slain. And then there's the prophecy. While visiting Hades, he met the ancient seer Tiresias, who prophesied his successful return and said he would then have to leave again.
Thereupon, take a well-fitted oar and go on till you arrive at the place of men who do not know the sea, and eat of food that has not been mixed with salt, and where they do not know about ships with purple cheeks, or about well-fitted oars that are the wings of ships. And I will tell you a very plain token. Do not forget it. When you meet a man who mistakes your oar for a winnowing fan, then set your well-fitted oar fast in the earth, and make fine sacrifices to the Lord Poseidon. Then go back home, and sacrifice sacred hecatombs to the immortal gods who possess broad heaven. Far from the sea will death come ever so gently to your person, and slay you when you are worn out with sleek old age, and the people about you will be happy.
Throughout the Odyssey, there has been the old philosophical conflict between fate and free will. The gods are stage managers of everything that happens, and yet Odysseus also owes his survival to his own cleverness and pluck. They created the role, but he acted it. The performance was all his.
It's a little bit like when we finally arrive, we humans, we die. But what we all want, and what Odysseus above all has, is to be able to say, not only when he gets home, but when he's on his deathbed, man, I lived a life. And that's part of what makes him both such a rich source of entertainment and a kind of inspiration who on the grand scale is what each of us wants to be, even if we can only hope to do it on a smaller scale.